I'm Robin Sharp, 30 Windermere Avenue, NW6, retired civil servant, chair of the Kilburn Locality Patient Participation Group, interim chair of Brent Patient Voice. You're correct about the evidence. Thank you.
I'm Peter Latham, chairman of Willesden Patient Participation Group, and I'm a retired circuit judge. My address is 55 Kendall Road, London, NW10. So far as the evidence is concerned, I should point out we submitted with our original evidence appendices, but appendices 2 and 3, which are our correspondence with Imperial and with North West London Hospital Trust about the accident emergency figures, have been missed out of the bundle. It's a rather tedious correspondence and you may not want to read it, but if you want it I can resend it. But importantly, in our update and response dated the 1st of May, we refer to an Appendix 6, and I haven't been able to send you that Appendix 6. That's my fault because of computer incompatibility. That is a chart that I think is quite important for topics you've been asking about, produced by Mr. Colin Stanfield, who gave evidence at Ealing. Professor Gallagher and Dr. Spencer this morning were giving as one of their explanations for the inability of Northwick Park Hospital to cope with the Type 1 accident and emergency 4-hour response times, a surge in demand. Mr. Stanfield has produced a very helpful chart that goes back several years, and this is Appendix 6, that reveals, if his figures are accurate, that there hasn't been a surge.
Can I ask
it's been remarkably consistent.
Can I ask you to pause there and simply confirm that you'll liaise with Mr. Smith and make sure that the missing appendix is provided in
Yes.
due course?
Then, since your question whether that's all...
I think we do actually have most of the documentation.
Do you?
We've spoken about.
All right, it's not in these bundles here.
So,
but I would like at some stage, convenient to you, to update on 2 of the topics that Dr. Spencer and Professor Gallagher talked about this morning.
If you do that by liaison afterwards, then we won't eat into the time you've got to give oral.
I can do it very succinctly when it's convenient to you.
Can I start to take you back somewhere you
Yes.
probably don't want to go? I just want to ask you very briefly about the consultation process. You heard Dr. Spencer this morning talking about the extensive efforts that have been made and the steps he'd taken in respect of that. Can you help with your view of whether the process was appropriate, and if you don't think it was appropriate, what you say was lacking?
We say in our evidence that we believe the process was flawed, and we think that is the case because in spite of a large number of documents printed, the main consultation document ran to 80 pages, and as a retired civil servant I know that ordinary members of the public would find it difficult to digest a document of this length, added to which there's extreme complexity in here because it covers 8 boroughs and very few ordinary residents or even health service nerds, which some of us have become since this document appeared, would find it very difficult to understand the situation in other boroughs. So it was a very, very challenging document. The simple, short document was so short that it was not meaningful. The response to the questionnaires, which was reported in a meeting held by Taking a Healthy Future, shows, for example, that of the questionnaires completed and the questions answered on the main option, the response was as follows. The heading was just over 3/5 support option A. But when you look at the numbers, that was 3,770 and 1,780 opposing. That's only 5,000 responses out of a population of 2 million. And since there was no stratified sampling, this is not a reliable way of gauging true opinion.
I think that's probably answered all the questions I was going to ask. Neatly broken down and then summarised back into one. Can I ask the we now turn to the question of A&E provision. Now, in your submission, the original one, it's at paragraph 1.7 on page 614, you talk about the marginal rate cap. And what I wanted you to do, if you could help us with this, is explain why you say this has an effect. Sorry, it's volume 2, I beg your pardon, volume 2.
No, I've got it.
Yeah.
Why you say this has an effect on A&E efficiency?
The marginal rate cap was based on a definition of appropriate accident and emergency department admissions based on a 2009 level. And as Tina Benson explained this morning, there is a disincentive built into the remuneration, because for patients over that level, they only have been getting 30% of the money, and that's been changed, or is proposed to be changed this year, to 50%. And as Tina Benson explained, the balance of that money, previously 70%, to be in the future 50%, goes to the clinical commissioning group. And there was a publication by the NHS last winter about the effects of this and the increase of the remuneration to 50%, explaining that there has been considerable tension between hospital trusts and clinical commissioning groups about what happens to the 70%, and transparency about how those funds have been used that were intended to provide at least part of the community services, in the hopes that that would reduce arrivals on the doorstep at accident and emergency. Well, it's clear that although Tina Benson and the Trust for Northwick Park say we don't allow that remuneration to affect the level of care for our accident and emergency patients, it does appear that when they were doing the projections for the closure after Hammersmith and Central Middlesex hospitals, that consciously or unconsciously, the level of remuneration affects the targets that they project. And as we've pointed out, it's likely to produce a reduction in morale at the hospital for all the staff concerned if there isn't the money, and they continue to lose money, and they already have, as has already been pointed out to you this morning, a deficit of something like 50 million a year. And it's clear that NHS England have had to recognise that this is a problem for many trusts, because despite their wish to put in place this disincentive, they've had to increase the money, and I think that's the large part of the reason. I can expand on that if you wish.
Can I just ask you, just thinking about the closure of the two hospitals at emergency at Hammersmith and at Central Middlesex, we've heard a number of witnesses now say that the closure wasn't related to the increase in pressure in Northwick Park. You, I think, take a different view. What's the basis for the assertion that the NHS witnesses are wrong about that?
I wasn't involved in this local NHS business until the autumn of 2013. My colleague Robin Sharp can talk better about the history and the consultation. But so far as the rationale that's put forward by Dr. Spencer and Professor Gallagher in relation to the two elements in the inability of Northwick Park Hospital to cope with the 4-hour waiting time class 1 level, two factors. One is that they insist on continuing to repeat the aggregated figures, which underplay the extent of the problem at Northwick Park Hospital for type 1 figures, and we've never been able to get from them the completely disaggregated figures for Northwick Park, but it's pretty clear that they would be worse. For at least 7 weeks in between October 2014 and now, the figures from Councillor Keith Perrin have shown have been the worst in England, and for many other weeks they've been bumping down at the bottom, fourth or fifth or second from the bottom. But there is an important factor that I've started by saying that I wanted to introduce. Dr. Spencer and Professor Gallagher have talked about two components in their difficulty in coping at Northwick Park with the accident and emergency arrivals. Number one being the planned excess, and secondly the unexpected excess due to surge. Well, that surge on Colin Stanfield's chart is simply inaccurate, and the figures have been remarkably consistent, and that reveals that what is likely to have gone wrong is that their projections and modelling for the Northwick Park and other surviving full accident and emergency departments after the closure of Central Middlesex Hospital and Hammersmith hospitals have been inaccurate. I hope that answers your question. I think Mr. Sharp has something to add.
If you press yours off, then yes, that's how it works, and you press yours on.
I don't think we've said anywhere that the NHS side claims are wrong. What we've said is that it's not been substantiated that there is no connection. We heard about a report being prepared internally in NHS England to look into the sort of deep reasons for this. Dr. Spencer mentioned this morning that this has not yet passed into the public domain. Some of us did receive a document from one of our contacts which appeared to be such a report. I think it contained one figure in it, which was a very bland claim, so it didn't enlighten us, but we have not been back to argue about where this came from, whether it was authentic, but nothing has been put into the public domain which shows there was no connection. What is really evident is that Northwick Park were not ready to deal with the situation, however caused. There was no surge in attendances. The range of attendances for all cases was between 5,500 and 6,500 throughout the period since last October, just after the September closures. It may be that the seriousness of the cases has changed. The fact that Northwick Park, with the assistance of the CCG, has put in, as we understand it, 50 extra beds to deal with people coming out of A&E, and that was last November, and is planning to put another 60 beds in place by the end of this year, surely that is absolutely clear evidence that it wasn't ready and that the planning was wrong and that some wrong assumptions were fed into the modelling, probably over-optimistic assumptions. Everybody may have been acting in very good faith, but clearly they got it wrong.
Can I ask you now a little bit about the out-of-hospital services for Brent? Now, we know about Wave 1, cardiology. Do you have a view about how effective or accessible the proposed or just started service is likely to be?
Do you want to
There are two services that have been put in place now. One is cardiology, which is now being run by the Royal Free and has been taken away from Northwick Park and the North West London Hospital Trust because they didn't succeed with their bid. And the second is ophthalmology, which is being provided at two centres, at Wembley Centre for Health and Care and Willesden Centre for Health and Care, by the commercial providers who run the Clementine Churchill Hospital. And there are two centres, so there is accessibility from those two different parts of the borough. Personally, I am less concerned about the travelling implications. My concern is clinical excellence. And for myself, if I were thought to have cancer, I would want to go to, say, the Marsden, or if I was thought to have some heart condition, I'd be very happy to go to the Brompton. And I know many people are concerned, particularly for poorer people, about the travelling problems. But my own personal focus is on clinical excellence rather than travel difficulties.
Thank you.
Thank
you. The ophthalmology service has been running since last September, and there is some information in the possession of the CCG about how it's working. I haven't seen any figures myself, but anecdotal reports to my patient participation group suggest that those people who've been there have been reasonably happy, and the GPs have been happy with the reports they've been getting. However, low take-up of this service has been cited as one of the key reasons for not proceeding with the Wave 2 procurement, which we've enlarged upon in our evidence and our supplementary evidence. And there must always have been an issue as to how many people exercising patient choice or how many doctors exercising GP clinical freedom would send people to this new and sort of untried service, as opposed to services that already seem to be reasonably available not too far away. Western Eye Hospital and Moorfields outstations and so on. The cardiology, it's really very short time since it began. What I've heard unofficially, it's not going very smoothly, but I can't tell you more than that. Thank you.
You actually brought me on to what I wanted to ask about next, which is the Wave 2 services. Just very briefly, because we've heard some evidence, what's your take on what's gone wrong with the procurement for MSK and gynecology?
That was the topic that I did want to update you about, so I'm glad you asked that question. Professor Gallagher gave a short summary in answer to your question this morning about the governing body's decision to discontinue the procurement of the Wave 2 musculoskeletal and gynecology procurements halfway through the bidding process. But Robin and I went to a stakeholder engagement meeting on the 9th of April, when the senior responsible officer for those two projects gave us some amplification of the reasons, which cast quite a different light on it from the emphasis that Professor Gallagher put on it this morning. And I can give you those reasons succinctly, I hope. You asked about the Mott MacDonald impact assessment this morning. I've read that. It is available, I think, on the CCG website. One reason that we were told by Howard Lewis, the senior responsible officer, for discontinuing that procurement was that the Mott MacDonald impact assessment was that of the about 9 million of budget for those groups of outpatient consultations, about 4 million was still going to have to go to the secondary hospitals in any event, because the draft specifications for both gynecology and for MSK had a whole list of accepted conditions which were going to have to go to the secondary hospitals in any event. I mean, cancer is one example. Some rheumatology conditions that have very toxic drugs were not appropriate for being managed in the community clinics. You don't want to hear the full list. I can give you more details, but I'm sure you understand the point. So that was one financial reason. A second important financial reason was that on examining the Bedfordshire MSK project that has been put in place, contracted to Circle Healthcare, And that's as I best understand it, a full-scale, multidisciplinary, integrated, combined assessment and treatment centre as proposed in the 2006 Department of Health document. They ran into serious difficulties for a very simple and important reason. The local secondary hospital in Bedfordshire was invited to become a subcontractor to the new MSK service, and in November 2014 they announced that they were not willing to become subcontractors and they were going to go into competition with the new private commercial MSK service. And as Howard Lewis told us, that has been a disaster because local GPs are continuing to refer to the secondary hospital that they have experience of and are not sending anything like the patient numbers that they wanted, that the CCG wanted, to their service. And so, in effect, in Bedfordshire, the CCG is paying twice over. They're paying the set-up costs for the new MSK service, and they're paying for the referrals that are continuing to go to the secondary hospital. And so it's perhaps not surprising that the Brent governing body GPs, on learning that, have decided we'd be wise to discontinue this procurement until we've had another think about that aspect of it. But that has important issues of principle, because Brent CCG, in their original draft specification for MSK, wanted to insist that GPs send all their referrals through the successful provider's triage service, which I thought was a disguised way of trying to achieve a monopoly, which may be unlawful under the EU, but it was also interfering with patient choice, and it was interfering with GP clinical freedom in relation to referrals. So I had to pursue an appeal to NHS England. NHS England upheld me on patient choice, and so patient choice has had to be reinstated into that draft specification, but they continue to want to have all the referrals going through the triage, and NHS England told me that they approved that as a way of improving the quality of referrals. But they've now discontinued. We suspect that there were other financial reasons because we haven't been told about those. I think that's probably sufficient.
I'm mindful of time.
Yes.
Please do go ahead. What I'm going to do is turn it over to the Commission, because I think that's probably the questions I wish to ask. So
Yes.
Start do if you wish to, and then the Commission, please do.
Just a quick extra word. On the whole, we think it's right that the CCG have now abandoned this procurement, but only after huge expenditure of time, money, involvement of outside experts and indeed patient volunteers. Had the advice that we were giving 18 months ago been taken, we might now be where Professor Gallagher suggested we should be this morning. Talk to existing providers, find out the strengths and weaknesses of the services now provided, and then see what is the best way forward. Everything can be improved. It doesn't necessarily all have to be thrown up in the air at huge expense, with the risk of hollowing out, a word was mentioned this morning, of the existing clinics. So we have, in Brent Patient Voice, suggested a round table involving all those with an interest in this topic before anything formal gets underway in terms of taking this project forward. And we're waiting to hear the response of the CCG to our suggestion. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Firstly, can I congratulate you on your contribution, if that doesn't sound condescending? In fact, reading it, I thought it was like a stiletto being politely administered into the body of the chef project. Though I'm not sure you quite killed the beast yet. There was so much...
You tried to be surgical.
Very polite.
There's also a sledgehammer from some other contributors going. But there's many things that well, I have to be honest, almost upset me, and also, I suppose, crystallise a lot of what I was aware of as a practicing GP. But I'll only pick up one or two. I'm interested in you spent a few sentences discussing the concentration of services. And in fact, you, on page 618, you actually say, when they talk about how it has been shown, and we all accept that stroke and heart attack, etc., should go to specialised units, and the evidence is there. But it does not follow that other common conditions needing urgent admission to hospital would benefit from some form of concentration. And I also have, I suppose I've touched a nerve with me, because I have a worry about outreach clinics, of which, and I come from a practice which 20 years ago used to run, I think at the last count, perhaps 8, 9, 10 outreach clinics, including gynecology, in the practice. But although it was wonderful for our patients, I know there was a cost to it. And so I suppose what I'm asking is this, but perhaps you could expand on what happens when you move clinics or fragment clinics. I'm worried about teaching, for example, that who's going to teach the new doctors coming up. I'm worried the fact that the consultant may be in the outreach clinic, which is, as a GP, was great for my patients, they thought we were wonderful, but takes that consultant away from being asked the junior about an acute problem that comes up, or gynecologist being told there's a problem on the labour ward. So in your reading and so on, do you think patients, or I call them patients or citizens, are aware of those difficulties, even though having an outreach clinic looks so attractive to them?
I think there's a big development that patients and residents barely begin to be aware of at all, and that is that NHS England and the Department of Health are encouraging GP practices to form networks and acquire legal NHS provider status so that they can bid to do specialist primary services such as diabetes clinics. I can see that may be a very good idea, but it unfortunately is bedeviled by conflict of interest issues, and the NHS in December have had to publish a paper beefing up the safeguards in relation to conflict of interest, and that's vividly illustrated in Brent CCG. And I hasten to say I'm not making any aspersions on the good nature and integrity of the doctors on the Brent's clinical commissioning board, but Harness Cooperative has acquired a provider status. They are a provider for some of the existing projects, but the chair of Brent CCG, Dr. Kong, is a member of Harness. The deputy head, Dr. Sarah Barsham, is a member of Harness. The clinical director, Dr. MC Patel, is a member of Harness, and one other member of the governing body at least is a member of Harness. And so there are a serious conflict of interest problems, and in our update and response we've pointed out that when they made the decision on the 25th of March, I think it was, to discontinue the current Wave 2 projections as a result of, or at least partly as a result of representations that I've had to make about conflict of interest, all those doctors had to leave the room, and the minutes of the executive committee, the report in relation to the discontinuance reveals that one of the factors that they had to take into account in discontinuing Wave 2 was that they're having difficulty in getting a quorum on the executive committee because so many members of the governing body are tainted by conflict. Now, I don't think the general public are aware that GPs are being very strongly encouraged to form these networks and acquiring provider status. And dare I say, you'll remember that Anaran Bevan said in relation to the specialists that the way he got what he wanted was by stuffing their mouths with gold. Now, whether the same thing is happening to GP provider status, I'm not sure.
Well, after reading your editor, I was prompted to dig out the RCGP article on managing conflicts of interest in clinical commissioning groups. So you've helped my postgraduate education at least. Just one final thing is, interesting, on page 627, you quote the King's...
Which paragraph?
Paragraph 2.16.
Yes.
You say that the King's College in recent years has been very burdened with such administrative reorganisations that inevitably are distracting from managing healthcare and disrupt consistency of long-term local healthcare planning and its implementation. Now, I suppose what my worry here is, and that set me thinking, that paragraph set me thinking, and the preceding paragraph set me thinking, is the Shaft project, with all its intricacies and conditional points and different organisations to relate and even to be yet created, is it a doable project? Or are we looking at one of the nation's computer projects that we've had in recent years? Or is it a TSR2, for example? So at what point, people, I'm not old enough to remember TSR2, I don't know, but is it, from your experience, as, well, I call you layman, I think is a bit,
yes, we're laymen.
measure to your knowledge. Is it a doable project? Looking as interested outsiders who want the NHS to work, and you've got no side to you, is it a doable project?
I've never been a member of any political party. I like to think I'm quite disinterested on this. In relation to both the Shaping a Healthier Future project and in relation to these planned care out-of-hospital projects that Brent want to do, I'm quite open-minded about the merit. I can see the concept could be made to work, and in relation to Shaping a Healthier Future, it seems to me that is not really such a difficult thing to manage. I'm sure Robin Sharp has managed 2 or 3 projects like that at once when he was a senior civil servant. It seems to me that the difficulty is because of so many people pulling in different directions with different interests. For example, in relation to the discontinuance of the MSK project, one of the factors that they took into account was the West Sussex situation, where the successful provider was BUPA, and BUPA pulled out because they were concerned about destabilisation of the secondary hospital, which goes back to the point that you were making about training facilities for doctors. Now, why Bupa should pull out because of that concern, I don't know, but clearly one strand of interest are the specialists, another strand of interest are the GPs. There are political issues on the right wing and the left wing as between privatisation and adherence to a free at the point of delivery state model. And then there are the interests of all the various NHS bureaucrats who may or may not privately support the idea of going for privatisation. Seems to me that the whole thing is made difficult because there are so many competing interests at stake, rather than the inherent difficulty of the concept for the project. Now, I don't know whether Robin Sharp agrees.
Yeah, well, I have my own take on this, and you focused on those paragraphs in the submission. It may well be that it's doable, but at what cost and at what benefit that's the issue. Not just to keep on with something that was probably first envisaged in 2009 and put into the public domain to some extent in 2012, and now rather opaquely proceeding as far as we're concerned. It seems to be basically going back to a strategy that Lord Darcy was prominent in terms of concentration. I think we're, in our experience and study of what's going on in the last 2 or 3 years, we would all be in favour of improved out-of-hospital services. But they have a long way to go. We can be critical and say, well, it said in the strategy that we've got hold of from 2012, all completed by March 2015. That was probably never realistic. All these things take time, they're incremental. But the big problem about even what was outlined there is that GPs are required to get more involved with hospitals, to pool services in the way that Peter's described in these networks, which are still very opaque and the patients don't understand them. We're told that a third of the GPs in London are due to retire in about 5 years, and the intake is not sufficient to replace them. And there are many who say that the GPs often need more time than they're given at the moment by the rules to have proper holistic consultations. So there doesn't seem to be thinking in shaping a healthier future or anything we've seen from the CCG since then, which really addresses this problem of GP capacity to take forward out-of-hospital initiatives. There's certainly a shortage of district nurses to deal with this integrated care, which we would welcome in principle. There's certainly a shortage of social workers because of the cuts that local authorities have had to face. So there's a whole series of very difficult issues which have not yet been faced up to, but I think we would like to see much more of a focus on that. And any question of cutting beds in acute hospitals has to be addressed in the light of the overall situation, and not just of the mechanical fulfillment of what was mentioned in 2012.
Fascinating, and it's very tempting to spend another period of time with anecdotes of different CCG conflicts of interest and bizarre decisions. But just a short question. You mentioned, it's come up again from this morning, the question of the costs of the abandoned procurement project. Has your group considered a freedom of information request to try to draw that out, and what response did you get?
At the meeting on the 9th of April of the Stakeholder Engagement Group, one of our colleagues, Dr. Michael Turner, non-medical, put forward 3 requests because this was the final meeting after the discontinuance had been announced. One of those was to call for the figures, both for the staff and volunteer time, and also for the consultancy fees that have been paid. And Howard Lewis told us that he was astonished at the money that had been spent on this project, but he didn't give us details. And the reply that has come back in relation to the minutes of that meeting is that Dr. Turner's request will be considered and will be told in due course.
But we will.
It might be worth considering a freedom of information request, which at least gives you some time scale you can complain about if it's not met.
Yes.
So, but I mean, you're obviously on the case. I just thought there might be something you haven't immediately thought.
We have submitted quite a few, but not.
Could I answer one of the questions that Mr. Wilcock asked this morning of Professor Gallagher? That was about the cost and reasons for cancellation of the referral facilitation service. In our response and update, that's the last document in your bundle, volume 5, page 1857. On page 2, halfway down the page, we give the answer to that. Another Brent Shaping a Healthier Future initiative was a referral facilitation service intended to improve the efficiency and cost effectiveness of GP referrals to secondary hospital. This was put in place for 1 year through the Harnish GP Cooperative NHS provider entity and the US Minneapolis, Minnesota Corporation United Healthcare. So far as we can discover, this has been abandoned after 1 year. Professor Gallagher explained that it was a pilot, since it didn't deliver value at a cost of about £375,000. Now, I can't remember the precise source from which I got that. I think it was from the CCG Executive Committee meeting minutes, but it's certainly something I've culled from one of the CCG documents. I hope that answers your question.
Your old skills haven't left you. I was about to ask that question. Thank you very much.